My name is James Robinson. I'm a university professor at the Harris School and the director of the Pearson Institute. And welcome to this rather bizarre Admitted Students Day. So let me just welcome you and congratulate you on being admitted to the PhD program and tell you a little bit about my research and what I do here at the Harris School and at the University of Chicago, and why I like it so much, and why I think it's such a great place to do research and do a doctoral degree. So my research is in comparative development, comparative economic and political development. I don't really like any of those boxes very much, but I suppose what got me started along the road that I'm on is trying to understand these big differences in economic development between different parts of the world. And the more I studied that, both when I was a student as an undergrad at the LSE and also as a PhD student at Yale University, I was just terribly unsatisfied with the way that economists thought about this. It just seemed to be there was no real way of thinking about why poor and rich countries were different in a fundamental way. There was just a description of technology or preferences. And a lot of my early work was trying to understand the role of political institutions, because I became convinced that it was political differences that could really explain why was it in some places that kind of an incentive environment emerged that created the opportunities and incentives for what every economist knows create prosperity: saving, investment, accumulation, entrepreneurship, human capital, innovation, technology adoption. We all know that, but what we don't know is why that goes on in some places and not others. So a lot of my work focused on politics. And immediately, if you start thinking about politics and how politics varies in the world and the different consequences of different political outcomes for development, you start thinking about institutions and political institutions. And some countries are democracies and some countries are dictatorships. And that seems like it must be an important source of variation in policy with consequences for development. But then you need to understand also why it is that political institutions differ. You can't just take that as given. So a lot of my early work looked theoretically at that, trying to develop models of the creation of democracy, the consolidation of democracy, the overthrow of democracy, which at that point, 25 years ago, just didn't exist, basically. There was no formal theory of political regimes, no theory in the way an economist would think about it. But in some sense, in my mind, that was always part of this project of development, of trying to understand development. So the first book that Darolas Moglu and I wrote, Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, doesn't really look like it has much to do with economic development. It's much more about political regimes. But in the back of our minds, there was always this agenda of, we need to understand comparative development, and that's related to politics and differences in political institutions, that we need a model of that to think about what causes variation in political institutions. So in parallel to that, we started doing a lot of empirical work, cross-national empirical work on patterns of comparative development, of historical processes that have created very different types of political and economic institutions in different parts of the world. And I guess, a lot of that work is summed up in the next two books we wrote, Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor, which came out last year, which is much more about the kind of institutional dynamics over time. But as I've gone on, I suppose my work has become more diverse, more interdisciplinary, more kind of methodologically diverse. So we use formal theory, we use kind of econometrics and causal inference. But in the last decade, I'd say, I've done a lot more field work. I've worked a lot in different parts of Africa, in Sierra Leone, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I've been doing field work for many, many years in Colombia, where I teach every summer, in Bogota. I've been doing field work in Nigeria, in Bolivia, in Haiti, just sort of trying to understand from a more ground up, almost kind of ethnographic perspective, like, how do people think about things? What do people think is important? Like what goes on in a much more inductive way and that reflects, I guess, my dissatisfaction with a lot of the received conventional wisdom. So I teach two classes at the Harris School. I teach a class on African development, which is a very eclectic way. It's kind of the way I think about African development historically and in the contemporary period, using work by economists, political scientists, anthropologists, historians, sociologists. It's a very interdisciplinary class, because that's where I am in terms of trying to understand why societies vary and what sorts of differences are important for explaining economic development. And I guess I'd say, I'm not sure that's all about politics. I used to think it's all about politics, but it's also about society and much more sociological structures and the way society coheres and functions, I would say. That's taking that seriously comes from having immersed myself, in many of these kind of much more inductive experiences. I also teach a PhD seminar with Chris Blackman on the political economy of development, which is just for PhD students, which focuses very much on kind of where's the research agenda in the political economy of development and what types of theories and models, and where's the research frontier, and what tools do we use, and what are interesting questions, and what questions haven't people asked, and what questions should they ask. So, that's an intensive class, really helping people get a hang of the literature, but also develop their own ideas about what's important and what's exciting. So, why is the University of Chicago a great place for me to be? A great place to be a student? Well, I think it's because it's so intense at this kind of intellectual level. There's a cliche about the University of Chicago that it's so intense, and it is intense, and it's very interactive. I always think, I taught at Harvard for many years, and in Harvard there's many interesting people who work on Africa, in economics, in political science, in sociology, in history, in religious studies, actually. But there was no place where everyone got together. There was never, there was no collegiality at that level. Whereas here, you have an African studies seminar where everybody who's interested in Africa shows up. It's very eclectic. You have anthropologists, you have historians, it's super eclectic. And sometimes, it's very hard for a simple social scientist like me to understand what's going on, but it's also very exciting. I think that one of the most interesting things about interdisciplinary research is that, we all get so caught in our silos, and we all get socialized into a way of thinking about what's important and what's interesting, and and then someone else comes with a completely different perspective, on those issues. And, I find that exciting. It just makes me step back and say, am I really asking the right question here? Have I got the right approach? Am I thinking about the right explanatory factors? So I think, for someone who's young, the way to make a splash and the way to make progress is to think of completely different ideas and completely new questions and perspectives. And I think what's great about economics nowadays, compared to what it was like when I was a student 30 years ago, is that it is much more open. Economics is it's a style. It's like a methodological style. But once you've mastered those tools and that style, you can ask more or less any question. It's just up to you, your creativity and your intellectual ambition. And I think Chicago is a great place for that. There are these very interdisciplinary seminars. There's incredible economists, everywhere, in the business school, in the law school, in the economics department, in the Harris School. You've got 4 places full of economists. You have extraordinary knowledge of anywhere in the world, Africa, the Middle East, any kind of period of history. The history department is just amazing. We've got the Oriental Institute, one of the premier archaeological institutes in the world. Archaeologists think just like economists. They're not so good at causal inference or math, but they love asking big comparative questions. So that's a very fun crowd to hang out with. So I think, what I like about the University of Chicago is just all of that intellectual vibrancy and curiosity and ambition, and and that's what that's why I find it so exciting. There's no room for complacency or resting on your laurels. there's always somebody fun to talk to and somebody fun to hang out with and learn from and inspire you. And you know, and so we'd like you to come and take part in this intellectual journey with us. I think that's what it is. And you know, the Harris School, maybe more than any place in the university, has this interdisciplinary perspective and interdisciplinary orientation. You know, people working in development, me and Chris Blackman, Ondrilla Dubé, some of the younger people, Luis Martinez, Raul Sanchez de la Sierra, Austin Wright. You know, we all come from different backgrounds, political science, you know, economics, and we're all interested in the world, in the field, in Africa, in Afghanistan, in, you know, in South America, and we all try to blend this kind of the tools of the economists, you know, the methods of the economists, with the nose or the instinct of a political scientist or an anthropologist, and you know, so you're asking a really deep question and you're coming up with a convincing explanation. So you know, do come. It'll be fun. And if any of you have any questions, you know, just send me an email. I know we're trapped into this rather bizarre virtual world at the moment, from which hopefully we'll all come out unscathed. But feel free to send me an email. It's on my email is on my webpage, jamesrobinson@uchicago.edu, and you know, we can talk on Zoom or Skype if you have questions. And let's hope we all get back on track soon. Okay, thank you.